So now we're going to hear from Felicia Rembrandt, and Felicia was founder of Gender Dissent, which she edited and wrote for 2 years. Since then, she has been writing for her Substack, Felicia Rembrandt Comments. She's just published her memoir, A Little Bit of God, about her recovery from childhood abuse, framed within a radical feminist analysis of the patriarchal constructs that enable child abuse. Now, note, if you are looking for the book, it's published under the name Felicia Rembrandt Felicia Klingenberg. so look for Felicia Klingenberg for that book. Okay, well, thank you so much, Felicia, and thanks for coming and talking. The title of Felicia's talk is The Canadian Election and the Wall of Silence. So over to you.
I'm now going to contradict many of the things that Pauline said, so I hope that's okay with everybody. The Wall of Silence. There was a federal election in Canada in April. The Conservative Party, led by Pierre Poilievre, was expected to win, as Liberal support had tanked. There's a third party, the NDP, and they were practically non-existent by that point. They continue to be practically non-existent at the federal level. As a result of the tanking of the Liberal Party, the wildly unpopular Feminist, Justin Trudeau, had stepped down and been replaced by Mark Carney. Many of you in Britain will know Mark Carney. He was a governor of the Bank of England after having been governor of the Bank of Canada. So prior to the election, there were 2 leadership debates, the first in French and the second in English. Scrums for the journalists were scheduled for after each debate, in which journalists could ask whatever questions they wanted. All journalists had been vetted. At the scrum after the first debate, some journalists from the independent media, that is, from conservative online platforms, surprised the members of the mainstream by getting to the microphones ahead of everybody else. They asked questions on subjects the mainstream media had been suppressing for years. In particular, Alex Zoltan of True North asked the Liberal leader, Mark Carney, how many sexes there are. Carney replied there were 2. Zoltan then asked him if women, biological women, were entitled to their own spaces, sports, changing rooms, etc. Carney gave a word salad sort of answer, culminating in, quote, "This is Canada. We value all Canadians for who they are and will continue to do so." Carney has a daughter who identifies as non-binary. The mainstream media was so incensed by the temerity of these independent journalists to bring up a subject they didn't want to cover, that while they were all waiting in a media room prior to the next debate, the English language debate, one verbally attacked the Indies for hogging all the question time. As Ezra Levant of Rebel News pointed out, the Indies got 4 questions and the mainstream got 4. Later, in a corridor, there was an actual physical altercation, or there may have been. Video evidence is pretty murky. The Debates Commission responded by canceling that evening's scrum. The 2 major TV networks, CBC and CTV, broadcast that this was because of safety issues, implying that the indie media had caused an environment that was no longer safe. It's worth mentioning that the indie media, Rebel News and True North, had sued the Debates Commission in previous years for the right to be accredited, and they had won. But the mainstream media accuses them of being profit-driven advertising platforms, or platforms driven by ideology rather than true journalism. I've seen both criticisms. But what is the mainstream media in Canada? The 3 largest television networks, CTV, Global, and CBC, get huge government grants. The CBC is actually a public broadcaster. The press in Canada is likewise indebted to government for funding to keep publishing. This has led to so much bias or potential bias that former mainstream journalists are starting podcasts and Substacks where they advertise that they have refused all government funding so that they can remain independent. One such podcaster, Trish Wood, former host of the prestigious documentary series Fifth Estate, now calls the mainstream media the cartel media, who work together as a bloc to suppress free speech. There is no critical coverage of gender medicine or gender ideology or the policy changes that resulted from the government's adoption of gender over sex as the major means by which people are categorized. And there has not been critical coverage since the Liberals under Justin Trudeau instituted those changes in 2016. The CBC in particular is fond of running sob stories about poor young men who claim to be women trapped in male bodies. The cancellation of the second scrum at the debates, caused by mainstream media outrage over the Indies asking illicit questions, strongly suggests that the MSM is in league with government to create the only agenda, the only narrative that is allowed. In Canada, that narrative is that men can be women, women can be men, and it's imperative that children be allowed to become their authentic selves through injections of puberty blockers, wrong sex hormones, and mutilating body modifications that will render them infertile, inorgasmic, and unlikely to find romantic partners among the sex of their choice. But nobody in Canada is allowed to choose romantic partners by sex anymore. That would be transphobic. We choose our partners based on gender. The media as a bloc decided that the important election issues were the ones that Carney was campaigning on, which were economic issues, particularly the threat of US President Trump and his tariffs. In their coverage, they resembled a circle of boys cheering on a fight between two men, Carney and Trump. Again and again, Carney flipped the bird at his opponent in a display of male aggression posturing. When he hit on the hockey term elbows up, he was successfully able to elbow the actual opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, aside and hook hockey-loving moms and dads into rooting for his team. This was not an election about issues. It was about which man could man up enough to beat up another man who was not even running. Conservative leader Poilievre couldn't even enter the ring, being painted as the runt version of Trump. When the dust settled and Carney had won the election, conservative commentators could blame the moms, the boomer women who voted for him, as the problem. There's always a mom to blame, isn't there? For Liberals, Carney was the hockey dad, the backyard barbecue dad. I was waiting for them to put him in a cardigan, but then they dressed him up in a hockey jersey for the win. It wasn't an election. It was a virtual Canada versus US hockey game. This is what patriarchy looks like. Good dads are still powerful patriarchs, and they exercise their power by dominating other patriarchs. The issues are not important. The impression of toughness and power is. For many, many Canadians, particularly women, the election was about women's rights, our rights to be sole proprietors of the term woman, to exclude all males from this category, and the rights of children to grow up with the truth about sex and bodies and the relation between the body and sex. Both the Conservatives and the Liberals had platform items about gender, the obstacle to these rights. The Liberal platform made multiple references to diversity on its election platform. More specifically, it listed 4 items. 1, standing up for the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, protecting the values it was founded on, which are under threat, and ensuring the protection of women, people with disabilities, racialized and Indigenous communities, and to LGBTQI plus people. Number 2, investing in women's sexual and reproductive health care and health research, including for those within the 2SLGBTQI plus community. 3, making funding permanent for the 2SLGBTQI plus community capacity fund. And 4, adding additional funding for the LGBTQI plus international assistance program. The Conservative platform contained only a tiny splinter in the plank as part of its platform. It labeled this plank restoring public safety. Specifically, defend women's safety by repealing Commissioner's Directive 100, which allows male offenders to be housed in women's prisons, and ensure that women's spaces and services remain protected in federal institutions and policy. That's it, tiny. What these 2 platforms show is that for the Liberals, gender as a category includes women and trans ID people with no recognition of conflict between those groups or of incompatibility between them. And the conservatives, on the other hand, recognize that women are in danger from gender ID policies that lump women in with trans ID males. Neither leader wanted to talk about this subject, nor did the mainstream media. Poilievre could have come out against trans ideology or for women's sex-based rights, as the most recent Conservative convention had passed 2 resolutions on the subject, one of them initiated by Coach Linda Blade. The 2 resolutions were, 1, to limit transgender health care for minors, that had 69% support, and to ensure single-sex spaces for women, that had 87% support. Women were defined as female persons to exclude transgender individuals. These policies aimed to prohibit life-altering medicinal or surgical interventions excuse me, for gender-diverse youth and protect spaces like women's prisons and bathrooms. Canadian gender-critical women did everything we could on social media, particularly on Twitter X, to persuade Poilievre to speak up about this tiny portion of his platform, but to no avail. If leaders don't want to bring up a subject and the media don't want that subject advertised or promoted, then silence wins out. In one of his first speeches after winning election, Carney warned that online American platforms are becoming seas of racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and hate in all its forms, and promised his government would act. This was a reference to the Online Harms Act, which the previous Trudeau government had been attempting to pass. As Amy Ham wrote in the National Post, Carney has hinted that his Liberal government will bring back some iteration of Trudeau's tyrannical, there is no other word for it, Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act, which was killed when the former Prime Minister prorogued Parliament this January. He had to prorogue Parliament in order to have a leadership race in advance of the election. You will recall that this now defunct legislation would have granted judges the ability to mete out life sentences for hate speech and would have created a government digital safety commission to police Canadian speech and impose life-destroying fines upon those whose speech was deemed hateful by our government censors. Additional information was provided by a law firm analyzing the repercussions of the bill. They wrote that Bill C-63 introduces significant changes to the criminal code, including a new definition of hatred, a new hate crime of offense motivated by hatred, carrying a maximum sentence of life imprisonment, and stronger sentences for existing hate propaganda offenses, including a maximum sentence of life imprisonment for advocating or promoting genocide. Well, everybody's labeling every little bit of something that they find insulting now genocide. Who's to define genocide? It also amends, they wrote, this group of lawyers, it amends the Canadian Human Rights Act to add the communication of hate speech by means of the internet or any other means of telecommunication as a discriminatory practice. The amendments will provide individuals with the right to bring a related complaint before the Canadian Human Rights Commission and authorize the Commission to assess penalties of up to $50,000. And these fines will apply to actual users, not to the companies, but to users, people like me. So first of all, any old Josephine, man in a dress, can bring a complaint to the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and that complaint can be directed at an ordinary person like me or anybody else in Canada who might say such a thing as, there's no such thing as a trans child. Just this week, Global News reported that the Carney government was indeed considering bringing back the Online Harms Bill, perhaps as it is and perhaps with changes. In another article a couple of weeks after Ham's article, journalist Tristan Hopper wrote about the upcoming implementation of the Online Streaming Act, a 2023 law that gives the federal government the ability to control the content of the internet in Canada. Basically, it requires them to follow the same rules for Canadian content as radio and TV. And we've always had certain rules requiring, up to 30%, I think, television and radio content must be Canadian. But the language of the Online Streaming Act also goes beyond mere Canadian content by hinting that streamers may also be subject to inclusive mandates on their content. The Online Streaming Act specifically requires broadcasters to produce content that reflects Black or other racialized communities, as well as Canadians of diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, and expressions. So the government is poised to impose censorship with regards to gender ideology and to force the creation of propaganda with regards to the same thing. Ban the facts, force the fictions. In the real world, Carney's government continues along the trajectory of the Trudeau version. On June 1st, the Liberal Party Twitter account put out this message: "We're looking forward to celebrating this Pride season with you all across the country." And that's Pride season, not Pride Day, not Pride Week, not Pride Month, but Pride season, the entire summer. Carney raised the Progress flag on Parliament Hill on June 1st and wished Canadians happy Pride. His government gave extra funding of $1.5 million to the Fierté Society to enhance safety and security at Pride events, reflecting a response to increasing backlash against LGBTQ+ rights. So, he and his government are aware that there is an increasing backlash, but there is no questioning of why. Rachie Valdez, the new Minister of Women and Gender Equality, which is known as WAGE, that's the government ministry, issued this communique on Pride. The Government of Canada is removing barriers still faced by two SLGBTQI communities, from safe access to gender-affirming care to opportunities in entrepreneurship and skilled trades. Through the federal 2 SLGBTQI+ action plan and Canada's action plan on combating hate, we're funding solutions that improve safety, support mental health, and strengthen community resilience. That's from her communique. And that includes a $25 million federal investment in Canada's first ever 2 SLGBTQI+ entrepreneurship program, launched in partnership with the Canadian 2 SLGBTQI+ Chamber of Commerce. She writes that Pride is both a celebration and a call to action, and the government will continue to stand with 2 SLGBTQI+ communities to build a safer, more inclusive, and more equitable Canada for all. WAGE's departmental plan for 2025, also issued by Rachie Valdez, incorporates 2 SLGBTQI+ into its mandate. From the plan, I'm quoting: "Addressing discrimination against 2 SLGBTQI+ communities continues to be a key focus. In times where 2 SLGBTQI+ rights are being threatened, WAGE will lead the rollout of Canada's first 2 SLGBTQI+ national survey to further understand the current needs of the community. As well, we will provide $1.5 million in funding to meet security needs for Pride festivals and continue to promote the 2 SLGBTQI+ anti-stigma campaign." All the trans and queer initiatives are located within the department that is supposed to be about and for women. This placement reflects the government's belief that there is no conflict between women and men who claim to be women. Support for the 2 SLGBTQI+ falls naturally to women. Support for one is support for the other. Now, it's possible that it's more sinister than that. I'm beginning to have a suspicion that the Department of Women and Gender Equality is actually the Department of non-white, non-straight, non-men. In other words, anybody who is not the most important and powerful demographic in society. I suspect that we are all being othered into one broad category, a sort of junk category. Carney has appointed former Justice Minister David Lametti as his principal secretary. Lametti shepherded the anti-conversion therapy bill through Parliament, the one that criminalizes all therapeutic interventions for gender-confused children and forces Canadians to affirm the lie that they are the sex they're not, and importantly, to have no preference for natural children. Lametti also had a role in the Emergencies Act invoked to stop the COVID protesters and freeze the bank accounts of the truckers back when we had the truckers convoy. In other words, to criminalize protests. So what has changed since I last spoke here on Feminist Question Time in 2022? The government's position is intractable. It still holds to the beliefs it held in 2016 when Trudeau brought his plan to replace sex with gender for all legal and administrative purposes out of hiding through Bill C-16. It was a government coup against the people. I hate to say it, but I think things are worse now than they were in 2016 because the trans cult has been drowning in government funding. It is big and bloated, and certain parts of it are becoming more and more powerful. And for 10 years, we had basically a man baby as our leader, and now we have the actual man behind him. Carney was the man behind Trudeau, at least for the last 3 or 4 years, if not from the very beginning. So what have we got, to fight this? Well, we have a promising new organization in the Free Speech Union of Canada, led by Executive Director Lisa Bildy, the lawyer who has been working on behalf of Amy Ham. And I'm sure you all know Amy Ham, the nurse who was tormented by the BC Nurse and Midwives Association. In an interview with Megan Murphy, Bildy laid out the 4 areas of engagement that the Free Speech Union will pursue. First, it will build a community of people aware of the need for freedom of expression and the dangers that will follow if it's lost. Second, it will create a legal network of lawyers with the desire and experience in pursuing court cases when someone's freedom of expression seems to have been curtailed. Third, it will campaign against harmful legislation. And fourth, it will work with international sister organizations because the Free Speech Union is international. All of these things are vital at this time when it seems people in Canada just aren't aware of the need for vigorous debate about all kinds of issues. Democracy hinges on it. The Free Speech Union has already begun tweeting about the dangers of the online harms bill. Secondly, the National Post. It is one of Canada's 2 national newspapers. It's a respected member of the mainstream media. It is increasing its coverage of criticisms of gender ideology. 2 or 3 years ago, it had some tentative efforts to offer balance to outright criticism. It now is moving more and more to criticism. It platforms both Amy Ham and Mia Hughes, the author of the WPATH files, and it gives space to intermittent other people as well. But Amy Ham seems to have a regular column. I think it might be twice a month. And Mia Hughes has already been featured twice as well. So Ham, Hughes, and Bildy are women to watch. Linda Blade is still a force too, but she's currently living in India. For institutions, I think we only have the National Post and the Free Speech Union. And I'm putting a lot of my hope in the Free Speech Union. Lisa Bildy is a real force, and she has come head to head with one of the most vicious proponents of trans ideology in Canada. We need people, particularly women with voices, with the ability to be heard. That's what we have not had. We can't change minds in Canada as long as our voices are censored. The lies and falsehoods of the trans cult have been exposed in the US and the UK with the help of right-wing media. We don't have the rabid far-right media that they have in the US, and I don't think anybody seriously wants it. But we need to find ways to force our governments to listen. And we need to do that before they clamp down via an Online Harms Act, more hate speech legislation, and forced propaganda.